So before I talk about equivalent fractions and your ruler, I want to introduce you to the ruler that you will be using in your fashion design classes. So this is the ruler that you will probably be using in your class, and you will become very familiar with it over the coming semesters. One important feature that you can see here in this picture is that the ruler is transparent. This allows you to get a full view of what you're measuring. This ruler that we'll be using in the video is 12 inches long, but it also comes in an 18-inch length, which is pretty much the same as the one we're working with, except longer. So I've brought in the wooden ruler back one more time and positioned it right up against the plastic one. And you can see that the plastic ruler divides up the inches in the same way that the wooden one does. The difference, of course, is that we don't have different lengths of lines to help us figure out what fraction we're working with. But let's use the wooden ruler while it's here to give us an idea of how this plastic one works. So recall on the wooden ruler, the smallest interval that things are divided up into are 1/16 of an inch. And we see that that pretty much matches the smallest interval on this plastic ruler. If you look closely, they don't always match, but that's just a distortion in the photographs here. But in real life, they line up exactly. So this smallest interval on the plastic ruler is also 1/16 of an inch. And bigger than that is the 1/8 of an inch. And the 1/8 of an inch works out really nicely on this plastic ruler. So this is an 1/8 of an inch here. And if you look past these 1/16ths, you see there's a grid that fills up the whole center of the ruler. Well, each one of those grid squares is 1/8 of an inch by 1/8 of an inch. So it's kind of like 1/8 inch graph paper spread across your entire ruler. And like I said, an 1/8 of an inch is the smallest interval that you generally use in fashion, so that comes in really handy. And so the next size, this, if you look down here on the wooden ruler, the next biggest one would be 1/4 of an inch, and that in fact corresponds with 1/4 of an inch here on this plastic ruler. So 1/4 of an inch is just 2 of the 1/8 inch squares. You can sort of look up and say, well, that's 2 of them. The 1/2 inch, we actually get a slightly darker or bolder line here. You notice that the inch lines are darker or thicker than the other lines, that these inch lines here are thicker than the other lines, while these 1/2 inch lines are also a little bit thicker. So the 1/2 inch lines are pretty easy to see because they're bolder than the rest. So this is my 1/2 inch. And last of all, the inches themselves. So, and furthermore, this other thing, a nice thing about this plastic ruler is you can measure on the ends a little bit too. You see that there's 2 inches worth of measurements on the ends because it's a grid. And they're not labeled, but it's pretty easy to see that it's an inch each. So at this point, you're probably wondering, so where are all of those equivalent fractions you promised me? Because that's what this video is supposed to be about. Well, in fact, the ruler is literally covered with them. So let's start by looking at 1/2 an inch. So here is 1/2 an inch up here. And that is clearly 1/2 of an inch. It's the bolder line, and there's 2 of them in that inch there. Now, it's also further divided into small intervals. So let's go over here and see how much we can divide it up. So here's my 1/2 an inch again. And we see that it's also divided up into 2 of these intervals here, like this. So 2 of those intervals, each one of those intervals is 1/4 of an inch. So to make up a 1/2 an inch, we have 2 of 2/4. So over here, this is a 1/2, and over here we have 2/4, because this 1/2 inch interval is made up of two of these 1/4 inch long lengths here. Here's 1/4 of an inch, and here's another. Well, we see that that's also divided up even more. So let's move along a little bit. So here's my 1/2 inch interval again off to the right. And if we look at our grid here, our 1/8 inch grid, we see that we can also divide our 1/2 inch up into eighths. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of those eighths. So this 1/2 inch, so here's 1, 2, 3, 4. So our 1/2 inch can be written as either 1/2, 2/4, or 4/8. But as you've probably guessed, we're not done yet. If we go over here, look at our 1/2 inch one more time, we see, look at the shortest lines, the ones that only go a little bit of the way down, and we remember that those short lines are 1/16. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 16ths. So depending on how we want to look at it, we can talk about our 1/2 inch in terms of quarters, eighths, or 16ths. All of them are equivalent fractions. So this equivalent fraction business doesn't just work with 1/2 inch. Let's look at another interval. So here, if we go from here to here, that is 3/4 of an inch. And we see that that 3/4 of an inch, we can talk about it in terms of eighths. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 eighths. Or we can also look at it in terms of 16ths and count 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 16ths. So we have 3 different ways to look at this. We can look at it as 3/4, as 6/8, or as 12 16ths. Now, if you look at these equivalent fractions, you may notice a pattern. And to do the conversion between these fractions, you may notice that you can just multiply the top and the bottom, or the numerator and denominator of the fraction, by the same number to get to another equivalent fraction. Here's what I mean. If we start with 3/4 and multiply the top and the bottom each by 2, we get 6/8. And that makes sense. There are twice as many eighths as there are quarters, so we're going to need twice as many of them to talk about the same length. And if we move on from 6/8 to 12 16ths, we see that if we multiply the numerator and denominator of that fraction by 2, I end up with 12 over 16. So multiplying the top and the bottom by the same number gives me an equivalent fraction. So here is something else that needs to be measured, but unfortunately it doesn't start at the beginning of the ruler. It does seem to start at a 1/4 inch mark though, so it seems like we could probably measure this by counting 1/4 inches. And in fact, we count 1, 2 1/4 inches, and see that this is in fact 2/4 of an inch across. Well, maybe you feel more confident counting in eighths, because after all, the grid on our ruler is made of 8 inch squares, so it's easy to identify an eighth. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 of those eighths. So an equivalent fraction, another way to talk about this measurement here, is 4/8. So they're both obviously correct, but is one of these better than the other? Or perhaps is there another equivalent fraction that's even better than both of them? Well, let's take a look over here. And I'm going to bracket off this length right over here. And this is clearly 1/2 inch because I started at this bold 1/2 inch line and ended at this even bolder 1 inch line. So if we look closely at this 1/2 inch, we see in fact what we suspected, that there are 1, 2 quarters in this 1/2 inch, and there are furthermore 1, 2, 3, 4/8 in that 1/2 inch. So another way to talk about this length is with 1/2. So all 3 of these fractions are equivalent to each other, but the 1/2 is special because it uses the smallest possible denominator to talk about this quantity. So recall, denominator is the bottom number in the fraction, and the 2 is the smallest of all of them. You may recall from math class that of all of these fractions, and for that matter any others that might be equivalent, that 1/2 is in simplest form, and the process of changing 4/8 or 2/4 into 1/2 is called simplifying or reducing. In fashion design, just like in math class, we try to express our fractions in simplest form or with the smallest possible denominator whenever possible. We're not going to get too deeply into this because you can generally find the simplest equivalent fraction just by comparing distances on the ruler like we did here. So here's another example of how equivalent fractions can make measuring easier. So you remember a video or so ago we measured a shape that was 7/16 of an inch long, and we did that by counting out sixteenths. Well, look at this here. We see that this shape is almost 1/2 of an inch long. So it starts here and ends here, and it's almost 1/2 of an inch, but not quite. So we're 1/16 of an inch, it looks like, short of 1/2 of an inch. So we know that 1/2 of an inch is the same as 8/16 of an inch. And if we take away 1/16 of an inch, we end up with 7/16 of an inch. 7/16 of an inch, which is what you get if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7/16 of an inch.